Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're taking a look at a pretty controversial topic, something called the serpent seed doctrine.
Oh, yeah. This one was a doozy.
Yeah, I mean, just from the name, you kind of get a sense that it's going to be a little bit out there.
Definitely fringe. Not something you'd hear in your average Sunday service.
Right, and the article we're working with today is from gotquestions.org, and they actually call it out pretty strongly as being problematic. So we're going to kind of unpack that and see what's going on with this.
Sounds good to me.
So to set the stage a little bit, the serpent seed doctrine basically says that Eve's sin wasn't just, biting into some forbidden fruit. It was something a little more, shall we say, intimate with the serpent himself.
Yeah, it takes the whole fall from grace thing to a whole other level. It's the idea that Cain, Adam and Eve's firstborn,
right,
he was actually the offspring of Eve and the serpent. And that makes him and supposedly all his descendants inherently evil.
So not just bad choices, but like bad blood, literally. I can already see how this could go sideways.
Oh, yeah. And that's exactly why groups with a history of, well, let's just say racism and anti-Semitism have latched onto this doctrine. It gives them a way to justify their prejudices using what they claim is the Bible.
It's incredible how a single interpretation can have such far-reaching consequences. But before we get into all that, I'm curious, who exactly believes in this?
Well, it's important to know it's not a mainstream Christian belief. Most churches, mainstream denominations, they don't teach this. You're more likely to find it in kind of fringe groups, cults even, like the Unification Church.
Right, the one founded by Sun Myung Moon, right?
That's the one. Yeah. Very secretive. And then you have figures like Arnold Murray. He had this thing called the Shepherd's Chapel.
Okay.
And a guy named William Branham, both of them, pretty big proponents of this serpent seed idea.
Okay, so we're talking fringe groups, secret teachings. This is getting more and more interesting, and a little creepy if I'm honest. But what I don't get is, what's their so-called proof? You can't just pull this stuff out of thin air, can you?
Well, they claim they're basing it on scripture, but you really have to do some mental gymnastics to make it fit. Like they'll point to Genesis 3.13, where Eve says the serpent beguiled her.
Right, classic serpent trickery. What's so special about that word beguiled?
Well, they twist it to mean seduced, like there was some kind of sexual encounter going on.
Oh, okay.
But the article we're looking at, it points out that this interpretation goes against, the actual context of the passage. And like the Hebrew word they're translating there doesn't really support that meaning.
So it's more like they want to see something scandalous there, even if it's not really there in the text itself.
Exactly. They're reading into it what they already believe instead of letting the text speak for itself. They also use Proverbs 30.20, which has this metaphor about eating.
Eating. How do you get from eating to the serpent seed?
Right. It's a metaphor comparing eating to sexual immorality.
Okay.
And the serpent seed folks, they latch onto this as proof that Eve's sin was sexual. It's a massive leap in logic.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty thin thread to hang such a huge claim on.
You'd think so, right? But they do it.
Yeah.
And that's not all. They also misinterpret the parable of the tares from Matthew 13.
Oh, the one where Jesus talks about the children of the devil. Isn't that, a parable? Aren't those supposed to be symbolic?
Exactly. But they take it literally. They say it refers specifically to Cain's descendants.
So they're cherry-picking verses, taking things out of context, all to fit their agenda.
That's what it looks like. The Got Questions article actually points out that you could only believe in the serpent seed doctrine by, already assuming it's true. It's circular reasoning.
It's like building a house of cards on top of a bunch of shaky interpretations. And wouldn't there be some pretty major contradictions if you tried to fit this doctrine into the larger context of, Christian belief?
Oh, tons. For starters, it goes completely against Galatians 3.28. The one about God's acceptance not being based on race or gender.
Right. And doesn't the Bible say that God loves and wants to save all people?
Yep. 2 Peter 3.9 is very clear about that. But this serpent seed idea, it promotes the idea that some people are just, inherently demonic beyond saving.
That doesn't sound very loving or merciful, does it? What else?
Well, here's another thing. Nowhere in the Bible is anyone condemned just because they might be descended from Cain.
That's a good point. And if we're talking logic, if Cain's descendants were, demonic, wouldn't they have had to survive the flood? How does that work with the whole Noah's Ark story?
That's a detail the serpent seed doctrine conveniently skips over. Plus, it shifts the focus of original sin from disobedience to something sexual.
Which seems to be a running theme here. It's like they're fixated on turning everything into a sexual sin.
It is a bit odd, isn't it?
Mm.
And totally out of sync with how the rest of the Bible talks about sin.
So, to recap, we've got cherry-picked verses, leaps in logic, contradictions with basic Christian beliefs. This is starting to sound less like a doctrine and more like, I don't know, a conspiracy theory.
It does have that vibe, doesn't it?
Yeah, and as we know, conspiracy theories can have some pretty serious consequences in the real world.
Oh, absolutely.
So I think it's time to dive into that next. How does this belief actually play out? What kind of harm does it cause?
We'll get into all of that right after the break.
It's kind of disturbing to think that something like the serpent seed doctrine can actually exist, and even use religion as a shield. But I guess that's what happens when you take any text, even a sacred one, and twist it to fit your own agenda.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. That's why it's so important to, approach these religious texts with a critical eye, It's not about tossing faith out the window. It's about thinking for yourself, engaging with the material.
Right. And the Got Questions article really emphasizes that. Reading without bias with an open mind. I'm curious, though, from your perspective, what would you say are the biggest downsides of this kind of thinking? We've mentioned racism, anti-Semitism, but it feels like those are just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Just imagine a world where certain people are labeled as evil just because of who their ancestors were. It's dehumanizing, takes away their dignity, and that opens the door to, all sorts of terrible things.
Yeah, and it's not just about individual prejudice either, right? This kind of thinking, it can seep into institutions, laws, even whole societies.
That's the scary part. We've seen it happen throughout history, time and again. Ideologies based on hate and exclusion, they can lead to discrimination, persecution, even genocide. And this serpent seed doctrine with this whole demonic bloodline thing, it's got the potential to fuel that same fire.
It really makes you think about the power of ideas, huh? How even these seemingly abstract theological debates can have very real and very bad consequences.
No doubt about it. Which is why it's so important to push back against these harmful ideologies with reason, compassion, a commitment to truth.
Yeah, this isn't just some obscure theological debate we're talking about here. This is about understanding how dangerous ideas can spread, even now in the 21st century. It's a wake-up call.
It is. And it highlights how important critical thinking is, media literacy, being able to tell what's true from what's not. We're bombarded with information constantly, and it's more important than ever to be able to really evaluate where it's coming from, what biases might be there, and ultimately think for ourselves.
It's funny, in a way, this serpent seed doctrine, it's all about deception, right? But the doctrine itself is a kind of deception, twisting the scriptures to fit their own harmful agenda.
That's a good point, and it highlights something really crucial. Blindly accepting anything, even in the name of faith, that can be dangerous. True faith, I think, should go hand in hand with the willingness to ask tough questions, to try to understand, to look at things from different angles.
I think that's a key difference for our listeners to grasp. It's not about choosing between faith and critical thinking. They can exist together. They should exist together.
Exactly. And when we come to our faith with that open, discerning mind, we're less likely to be taken in by extreme ideas that, twist and distort what faith is really about.
So this serpent seed doctrine, in a way, it's a warning sign. It shows us how, even in matters of faith, we've got to be careful, be discerning, be willing to challenge ideas that go against those core values of love, compassion, respect for everyone.
Well said. And it reminds us that finding the truth, it's not a passive thing. It takes work, critical thinking, and a willingness to look at the hard stuff, the complexities. We can't just take things at face value, especially when those things could hurt other people.
I know we've been getting pretty serious here, but there's something I've been wondering about. We've talked about misinterpreting scripture, but what about the people who genuinely believe in this serpent seed idea? What's going on in their minds?
It's a good question. And it speaks to something that's very human, that need for meaning, for belonging. Sometimes people cling to extreme ideologies because they offer a sense of certainty, of purpose, of community. It's a way to make a complicated world feel simple and to feel like you're part of something bigger.
And with something as, powerful as faith, those needs can be even stronger.
For sure. For some people, the serpent seed doctrine might be a way to explain evil, suffering, things they see as unfair in the world. It gives them that clear line between good and bad, a sense of order when things feel chaotic.
But as we've seen, that order comes at a high cost. It dehumanizes entire groups of people. It justifies prejudice and hate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why it's crucial to address not just the theological problems with this doctrine, but also the psychological needs it might be fulfilling for the people who believe it.
It's about remembering that behind every belief system are people dealing with their own emotions, their own fears, their own desires.
And even though we have to reject hateful ideologies, we should try to understand why people are drawn to them in the first place. That's how we can effectively counter them with messages of hope, of inclusivity, of compassion.
This conversation has really shown me how important empathy is. Even when we're talking about beliefs that we find repugnant, we're all part of the same human family, struggling with the same big questions.
And even when we disagree, we should try to maintain respect and understanding. It's not about accepting bad beliefs. It's about recognizing that we all share this human experience.
This is a lot to take in, and I have a feeling this deep dive is going to stick with me for a while. It's challenging, it's unsettling, but in the end, I think it's a necessary look at how beliefs shape our world, for better or worse.
I agree, and I hope it encourages our listeners to engage with these questions themselves, to really look at what they believe and to think about how those beliefs affect them and the people around them.
You know, the more we dig into this, the more I keep thinking about how careful we have to be when we interpret these kinds of texts, you know, religious or not. It's like we're dealing with something really powerful. It could be used for good, or like we've seen with the serpent seed doctrine, it could be used for something really bad.
It's true. It's a lot of responsibility. And that reminds me of something the God Questions article pointed out. It's how the serpent seed doctrine kind of plays on people's desire for easy answers. You know, they want things to be black and white, simple.
Oh, yeah. It's way easier to just point the finger at some, I don't know, demonic bloodline than it is to actually try to understand the messy reality of good and evil, free will, how society works, all that.
Right. The world and people, we just don't fit neatly into those little boxes. And when we try to force everything into those categories, well, that's when things can get really messed up.
So how can we, like as individuals, how can we protect ourselves from falling into those traps? How do we keep that balance between faith and critical thinking that we were talking about earlier?
Well, I think it starts with understanding that asking questions, thinking critically, that doesn't have to be the enemy of faith. In fact, I think it can actually make your faith stronger.
That's interesting. So instead of being scared of those tough questions, we should see them as like opportunities to learn more, understand better.
Exactly. It's about approaching our beliefs with a bit of humility. Like, we don't have all the answers. No one does.
And being okay with the fact that we might be wrong about some things.
Oh, absolutely. I'd say that being willing to admit you might be wrong, that shows real intellectual honesty. It means you're willing to learn and grow.
It's about always learning, changing, not being stuck in some rigid way of thinking.
Right. And that means being open to other perspectives.
Yeah.
Even the ones that make us uncomfortable, the ones that challenge what we believe.
So it's not just about reading and studying by yourself. It's about having those conversations, those sometimes difficult conversations, you know, hearing from people who see things differently and really grappling with those tough truths.
That's where the real growth happens, both for us as individuals and for society as a whole.
What would you say to someone listening who might be struggling with these very questions right now? You know, maybe they've heard about this serpent seed doctrine or something similar, and they're feeling confused, maybe even a little scared.
I would say, first of all, it's okay to question. Don't let anyone tell you that having doubts means you're weak in your faith. Sometimes doubt is what leads us to a deeper understanding.
So we need to give ourselves permission to sit with those difficult feelings, those confusing things, not just try to shove them down.
Right. And don't be afraid to look for good information, you know, from people who know what they're talking about. There are so many scholars, theologians, people who've spent years studying these texts, wrestling with these questions.
It's not about figuring it all out on your own. It's about finding those trustworthy guides and having those meaningful conversations.
Exactly. And always remember, faith is a journey. It's something that unfolds over your whole life. There are going to be times when you doubt, when you're confused, even when you're angry. But those are the times that can make your faith stronger in the end.
So it's about being an active participant in your faith, not just passively accepting whatever you're told.
Right. That active participation means thinking critically, being open-minded, and really engaging with the world around you.
Well, I think we've covered a lot today, and I know I've got a lot to think about, and I'm sure our listeners do too. This whole deep dive into the serpent seed doctrine has really shown us how powerful ideas can be and how even the craziest sounding beliefs can have real consequences in the world.
It's also shown us how crucial it is to think critically, to be careful about how we interpret things, and to be willing to stand up and challenge harmful ideologies, no matter how popular they might be.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this one last question to ponder. Does the existence of things like the serpent seed doctrine, these extreme interpretations, does that change how you approach reading religious texts? Or any text, really. How do you balance faith with critical thinking, especially when you come across ideas like this?
Keep exploring these questions. Talk to people. Have those conversations. And always keep searching for a deeper understanding of the world around you.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeking the truth, wherever it might lead you.